back to this engine assembly again. I think last time I mentioned I've now got the crank rotating. It's a bit too hard to turn it by hand, but the pistons do go up and down, and I was looking at the head gasket, which is this, which will go on there. And I did ask someone who builds these engines for a living, so he does it professionally, what he does about the overhanging gasket, and he doesn't worry. So it's okay to assemble it with this gasket. I don't think it's actually going to make any difference. The reason that the gasket is fractionally smaller than the bores is because these have been bored over plus 60, so 1.5 millimeters bigger. But when you do that, you only bore the cylinder. You don't actually make the head any bigger here. So this doesn't get machined at all. So you're always going to get a little bit of a step here, unless you were to machine the head as well. So that tiny bit of overhang, I don't think it's really going to matter. As well as doing this, I did something I've been meaning to do for a very long time, which is I have actually dyno bolted the mill to the floor with some M12 bolts, and I was never able to do that in my last house because the garage actually had underfloor garage heating, which I never used, but of course that means there's going to be wiring underneath the floor, and I didn't really want to go drilling into it to bolt the mill down. So yesterday I got the bolts and I had to get a masonry bit, but this is now bolted down firmly to the concrete floor. I then had to go and retram the mill. So on this mill, the top is bolted on with these 4 big bolts, and the way you tram it, which means making sure that the bed of the mill is completely perpendicular to the spindle going up and down. And the only way to do it on this mill is to shim it. And I spent ages at the last house trying to get that right. And because I've bolted it down now, it's a lot more rigid. I had to redo all of that. So I started by taking out all the shims I had in there before, which, as you can see, are quite a few, and I re-shimmed it. And it only actually needed a couple on this side. And I've got it pretty true now. I think it was a couple of thou out over about 12 inches across the middle there. So after I did that, have everything bolted down, I also had to rebolt on my milling vise and just make sure that was set up properly so it's running true. And I started playing with the fly cutter again. This is a little fly cutter I made some time ago, and I'm going to need that to mill flats in the top of the piston. And I've just been practicing. I wanted to make sure the mill was all working and that I had it set up. I don't have any old pistons to practice on, but these are aluminium cupcakes I made last time I melted down some aluminium. So this is what I end up with. I melt it down, get the slag off the top, and I pour it into a cookie pan basically, and end up with these sort of aluminium blocks. And these are quite good just for machining down and practicing on. So I've been practicing with the fly cutter to make sure I'm going to be able to do it on the piston, and that's working really well. I ground up a new tool for it, so when the time comes I should be able to mill the flats onto the piston. And I think what I will do is use this giant lump of nylon, which I've had sitting in my box of offcuts for years, just waiting for the right thing to use it for. And I think what I'll do is I will very carefully move the gasket. On the lathe, I should be able to bore this out to fit a piston into it, and I'll probably cut a split on the side so that I can then clamp this whole thing into the vise, squeeze down on it, hold it at the right 45-degree angle, and then I should be able to machine the two flats that you need, because if you imagine this is a piston, they're domed. You can see the dome on there, so the piston actually comes up into the chamber. So you need to make sure there's clearance here where the valve's open. So it means machining these two 45-degree flats on the sides of the piston head. So that should be, it'll be nerve-wracking, but hopefully it's not too tricky a job. So the next thing will be making the sort of holder for the piston, I guess you'd call it. Hopefully my little lathe should be good enough to do that. And the other thing is my little outdoor office was delivered during the week, so I'm slowly setting that up with all my electronics and 3D printing type stuff. So I've started clearing a bit more space around here. This stuff all still needs to be sorted out, but there's a lot more room here now. So the Austin will probably come back here, and I'll put the MG in there, and I'll move the Riley so I can start assembling it all here probably. The other thing I've been looking at is the engine stand. So as the engine's mounted on it here, obviously you can't get the flywheel on there. So it'd be really handy to be able to bolt this on sideways. So this whole engine is turned that way. So I've been going through my scrap bin again, and I found, this isn't the tube I'm going to use, I'm going to get to that in a second, but I found some offcuts of plate and some good solid angle, and what I'm thinking I'm going to do is cut this so that it'll bolt on there. You can see this is curved, so I'll need to cut a sort of curve out of that so it'll fit up on there nice and tight, so I can bolt that on there with 2 or 4 bolts. And then if you imagine that's there, this is the engine bar, the engine mount basically, and you can see it's a threaded bar with these big nuts on the end. What I will do is weld this plate onto there with a hole through it, so that'll mount, the engine bar will mount through the hole in the plate, and the tube will be welded onto there so that this tube can mount on the existing engine stand through there like that. And then the engine will be mounted sideways. This is only thin wall tube, so I can't use this, but my neighbour across the road is a farmer, and he said to me, "Oh, come over, I've got a pile of scrap under the shed, you know, come and help yourself. If there's anything there you need, just come and grab it." So we found this piece of I think it's 60mm, 65mm heavy wall steel pipe, so I'm going to make the actual support out of that. I may look at doing that now. This is what I've come up with for the new mount for the engine crane to fit a Riley 9 engine. Just a piece of angle that bolts to where the gearbox bolts on there. I had to sort of cut a curve in that so it would fit on this, and a piece of flat plate that goes, the engine mounting bar goes through, and that bolts on there. I did think that this was going to go on the inside of this plate, which is why I cut off the corner there, but it actually lines up better on the outside. You can see there is actually a little bit of a twist in it, so I may still put it on the inside. There's rubber inside these mounts, so there's a little bit of flexibility there, and I can just bend it so it fits. I think I'll probably still weld it on the inside just to be neat, but there's plenty of space around there to weld. And then this is just the tube, and I'm going to have to weld that. I think I'm going to weld it more this side, so because the flywheel will go on here, and there's quite a lot of weight in the flywheel, so I don't think I'd be able to get this to a point where it balances, because until you've got the flywheel on there, all the weight's going to be in the front half because of the crank and the rods and the pistons and the head and all of that. With the flywheel on the back, you've got more weight here, so I'll probably end up putting this somewhere about there. It doesn't have to balance perfectly anyway, because this will be cross-drilled and there are pins. There's a pin that goes through it, and that's what stops it rotating. It's just to make it easier to rotate the engine around, but it's not too hard. It's not that heavy. Unfortunately, we've got guests coming, so I'm going to have to stop here now and hopefully finish this up tomorrow. It should just be a bit of welding and then the drilling of the holes in this tube. It's quite good actually to finally be making a mess again. So my new workbenches are finally getting a bit of use, which is good. I won't have time to clean up the mess tonight. I'll have to do that tomorrow as well. Just looking at this again, it's lucky I haven't welded this on yet and that I actually have more pipe, because I just realized regardless of where I weld this, I have to take into account the fact that the engine mount is going to stick out this far, whatever that is, about 2 inches I guess, which is important because when it's mounted on the frame here, on the actual stand I mean, I'm going to need to make sure that that mount that's going to stick out to here, that could be a bit annoying because it'll hit the frame when you're trying to rotate it. I think it'll actually be okay, because if you think about it, it's only going to hit when it's at the bottom, which means it would hit. I think that'll be all right, because if it's only hitting at the bottom, if you imagine this is the bottom, this would be the top of the stand, you may want to turn it that way to be able to get to the flywheel, to be able to put the flywheel down like that. Imagine if it's that way, so that this is the top. This is a little bit offset, so I don't think that'll be a problem. It won't be completely flat because this will be hitting the engine stand, but you can still rotate it around enough. I don't want to make this too long because then it's overhanging a bit too much. So I think that should be okay. I finished welding up the engine mount this morning. I did make one tiny error, which was drilling the hole for the pin here. I forgot to take into account the width of the weld, so I did have to extend the hole in the engine mount just a little bit. I just had to slot it a bit so I could get the pin through. The other thing I discovered is not all of these blocks are the same. So this block, you can see there's quite a scallop where the bolts go through. So my mounting plate here, I ended up having to get a bit creative with the angle grinder and grind to the inside of that, and also ended up using slightly smaller diameter bolts than I would have liked to get this plate to actually fit onto this block. So not all the blocks are the same. The other one isn't quite as pronounced as this, but smaller diameter bolts here aren't going to hurt. These are high tensile bolts and there's 4 of them, so that's not going anywhere. And this mounts through the engine mounting bar. The good thing is I can now flip this any way I want, including on its ends, so I can have this vertical. I'll show that in a minute, but with it like this I can get to either end of the either side of the block, flip it up whichever way I want, and it balances on there quite nicely. So I'll flip it around so you can see how it'll make it easier to get the flywheel and clutch on. This just shows how the engine can be rotated to be vertical. Because the bar is offset, it doesn't actually hit the frame, which is kind of good. But you can see in this position it's quite easy to work on the the flywheel and clutch. You can sort of assemble it all on here at a decent height. But I think that's going to make it a lot easier to work on this engine. My drip tray, which is just aluminium foil with some old hard drive magnets in there, they just stick it to the bottom of it quite nicely. But you can see how this gives you full access to the engine. Everything rotates still. It's a bit stiff, but that should be fine. So all I have to do now is start building it.